Hey everyone, CJ here. Welcome to the Wonder Church podcast. I believe that discipleship happens in the context of relationship. So, I would like to invite you to join me this Sunday at 10 a.m. at Redmond Middle School in Redmond, Washington. Or if you're not up to it, feel free to stay tuned to our podcast and YouTube channel for more content that is true to biblical doctrine and safe for people with questions like me. Until then, I pray that God speaks to you through this message.
We did prayer before service, and I have a message in here that I wrote, and I'm prepared to give, but I'm not going to do that. So, look, you come to somewhere new, and honestly, if you're a pastor or you speak at all, you know you get to bring your A game, right? You can grab your best message and look like you are an amazing communicator and that you are so well prepared, and people will just love you, and they'll be like, can we have him back, please? And what I'm going to do is preach a message that I have not written or I'm not prepared for. So I don't know how that's going to go, but here is what I keep hearing. You know, when you say you have a word, simply this: get out of the boat. Now, I'm going to go to Peter walking on the water. I know the passage. I have spoken a message out of there before, so it's not like it's unfamiliar. But you guys all probably know that in this building, there's no Wi-Fi, there's no internet access, and so even how I'm going to read it is going to be out of a translation that I never read. It's the American Standard Version, apparently, which is what comes up when you're offline. So we'll read out of the American Standard Version. But my thought is, get out of the boat. And why? So I want to tell you a little bit about my story. I am, let me pause. One, it is an honor to work with CJ and Nicole. You guys have no idea. It is an honor to work with CJ and Nicole, Madison. I mean, you guys have an amazing team. Their humility, right, and how they lead and how they love is incredible. And I just get the pleasure of walking alongside them. It's a great joy to us at Cedar Park just to be a part of this team, that we get to say, hey, we're connected to Wonder Church because they're so cool. I wish we could be that cool. And so it's just really cool. And so get out of the boat. So by telling this, can I tell a little bit of my story? And so, because here's the thing, as I kept thinking during our prayer circle, during worship, is that there's so many times in my life where I've been one of the disciples that stayed in the boat. Way fewer times when I've been the guy that got out of the boat. Now, if you're not familiar with the story, I'm going to read it in a few moments, but I have been in full-time ministry now for 6.5 years. I'm 55. So that's an interesting story. When I was a teenager, I remember I grew up in the church, actually, right down the street at Redmond Assemblies, where I grew up going to church. And at a youth camp, I remember somebody praying, and I felt like God was calling me toward ministry. As a teenage boy, I had no idea what that meant, nor did I have any interest in that. I just thought, what does that even mean? I knew my uncle was a pastor, and I didn't think that looked very fun. From just my watching of him, I thought that doesn't look like a fun job, and it certainly doesn't look like he makes any money. And so none of those things about it seemed appealing to me, so I just kind of went on my life in such that I finished high school. I had zero idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. Zero. So I almost joined the Marines, got out of that right last minute, and then I went to Shoreline Community College because I thought, I guess I should go to school. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I didn't want to invest in a university yet because I was just confused. And so I did that for a couple of years, but I just kept feeling like this wasn't right. But I worked in retail, and one day I saw my boss's, his paycheck was sitting on the counter, and I saw his pay stub. And he was the store manager, and it was a lot, and it was well over 6 figures. And this is when I was much younger, so it's even more then. And I thought, well, obviously, this is what I'm supposed to do because I can do that job and I'd love to make that kind of money. And so I just started down the road. I was going to work in retail. And so then I just kept doing that and I kept moving up the ladder. And I was one step away from getting to the bonus category in retail, right? So I was the number 3 in the store, and it was my turn to run the store because the number 2 guy was out getting trained to be a number 1. And usually, if you did a good job, you'd get the next number 2 spot that would open up. That's kind of how it worked. And so, of course, I did an amazing job, in my opinion, and did that. And so it was time, and suddenly my wife and I are talking and praying, and we're like, you know what? This isn't where you're supposed to stay. I'm like, but this is easy. And so, like, my mom calls me. You're thinking the next decision is good. So my mom calls me and says, hey, I think you should apply to be a claims adjuster. And I'm saying, well, what does a claims adjuster do? And she goes, I don't really know, but they argue with people, so I think you would like that. And so into my personality you go. And so I said, okay. So I applied for this job that I had no background or qualifications in, and they hired me. So I worked in the claims world for it ended up being about 20 years. And along that way, we started attending Cedar Park Church in Bothell. And along that way, the youth pastor said, hey, Steve, can you help out, be a youth leader? I'm like, okay, sure. I don't know what that means, but okay, sure. So I started helping out, going, and then a few months in, he says, hey, can you lead a small group? Keep in mind, you see me standing here today, but I am incredibly shy. I don't like speaking in front of people or being in front of people or leading people. It's very difficult for me. My wife so badly wanted to be here today, but she's actually was scheduled to do some things at Cedar Park Bothell. And so she would confirm that I was super shy. Never in her wildest dreams would she imagine that I could stand in front of people with a microphone. And so anyway, so he says, can you lead a small group? I'm like, okay, fine. And so then he says, after that, hey, can you speak on a Wednesday? And I'm like, what? Okay, I guess so. So I spoke on a Wednesday. I was terrified. My mom snuck in. I told my mom I was to speak, and she snuck into church, but she knew that I would be incredibly nervous if I saw her, so she hid back behind some wall so she could listen and I wouldn't notice. And so I spoke on a Wednesday night, and then what began to happen was I began to feel, I'm going to cry today, I think. I began to feel that tug of God on my heart. Like, Steve, remember, I've called you to ministry, and you haven't yet taken that step of faith. Get out of the boat kind of faith. So keep working. And I worked at Pemco Insurance. I was a claims guy, did all kinds of claims that you can imagine. And every about year and a half, I would switch jobs at the insurance company. I just kept switching different areas, different departments. And one day they had just announced that I was on a new team and I was doing a new role. And I'm walking by. We had a receptionist that was in our Linwood office at that time. Her name was Karen, and not a believer. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm walking by, and she says, hey, Steve, you keep changing jobs. And she said, what you're looking for is not here. Looking at this lady, like, I know she's not a believer, right? And I'm just like, what are you saying? And she goes, you need to go somewhere else to get what you're looking for. She doesn't know what she's saying. I'm walking away going, oh my goodness. But guess what? It's easier to stay in the boat. I kept working, doing what I do, and God kept calling, and eventually I did schooling and did the necessary stuff just in case. I thought, I'm going to do the education just in case. God, if there's something, we want to be ready just in case. Not that you're going to do anything. And so years later, I think it was, 23 years ago or so, the executive pastor at Cedar Park called me and said, hey, one of our branch churches needs a youth pastor. Can you head over there? And so I said, well, okay, sure. So I went over to Kenmore Church, and I was youth pastor there for a year, part-time, very part-time. I had my other job, so it was cool. And then we had some friends who lived in Chicago call us up and say, hey, we want to fly you to Chicago. We want you to come and be a youth pastor at our church that's just a couple years old. So they flew us to Chicago, and I'm not talking, a lot of people say Chicago, and they mean the suburbs, okay? I'm talking about in the city of Chicago, downtown. So we were in the city of Chicago. We had a Filipino pastor and a black church, American black, African black. So it was very diverse, so diverse that I was white there. Technically, I'm half Mexican, but there I was white. My family was one of 2 Caucasian families at the church. And so we went and visited, and my wife and I both felt like we probably should come. But I was like, they're offering me $500 a month as a stipend, just, part-time. And then I would have to find another job, well, which I didn't have lined up. And so, again, it's more comfortable in the boat. So we went back home, and they told us to pray about it. And after a couple days, he called, and I said, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. And he goes, okay. So Amy and I went on our way, kept doing our thing, and Amy kept saying, I think we're supposed to go. And I'm like, Amy, how? We have kids, we have a home here, our expenses don't disappear. And so we just kept doing our thing. And, about 2 months later, he calls me back. And he says, hey, we really think you're the guy that's supposed to come. We haven't hired anybody yet. We think it's because it's you. I said, I'm a planner, remember, I think. And I said, you haven't hired anybody because you're offering them $500 a month. I said, it's not like it's super enticing, and you're asking me to move across the country. But as he's telling me this, here's what's happening. He doesn't know this, because on my side, my hands are shaking. My inside's shaking, because I know that I know we're supposed to go. And I'm just like, this is the craziest thing. God, there's no chance. It's too windy outside. The waves are too big. There's no chance I'm stepping on the water. It's not going to happen. He goes, I just need you guys to pray about it. I said, okay. I said, we will pray and fast. I said, give us at least 24 hours. He said, okay. I hang up the phone. At this time, that stupid, was it movie or play or whatever it was, Chicago, was here. Do you know that every billboard, every side of the bus, every TV commercial, you could not look anywhere without seeing Chicago, Chicago, Chicago. I mean, you couldn't look anywhere. Hang up the phone, and we're just like, Amy, I think we're supposed to go to Chicago. And so we kind of figured out, I don't know how this is going to work, God, because it's not like I was sitting on a ton of cash that's going to just float us to pay our bills that don't go away when you move. And I didn't have any kind of job, so I quit my job, got rid of our house, and we moved our family to Chicago. When we got there, we moved in with a senior pastor for the first couple of months, and lived in their home, and started working at this church and looking for another job. And can I tell you that within about 60 days, I had found another job. And probably within about 90 days, I had a job that was paying more than I was making here, along with God's blessing, at the church. This is not an exaggeration. There were 8 students on that first Sunday there. 4 years later, when we left, there was 120 that were in this youth group. We saw God's hand involved all the way through. Now, I'd like to say that once we made that move to Chicago and we saw God's hand and God's blessing, that I was cured and I can walk in faith all the time. But the truth is that two years later, we were 2 years into our stay there, and I so badly wanted to come home. I was raised here. I also was seeing the age of my oldest daughter, knowing that a couple years, give or take, she's going to meet a boy. And I did not want her to live in Chicago because I wanted her to live close to where we lived. And so I was like, Amy, we have to leave. And so I started, visiting back home, not saying anything to anybody in Chicago, and just saying that setting up opportunity here to move back. And so I made my last trip here. Even in my meeting with people here, I was saying we're coming back, but inside I wasn't eating, I wasn't sleeping, because I knew that we weren't supposed to come back yet. But I still wanted to. And so came back home and I was like, okay, Amy, next weekend we're going to tell our pastor that we're going to give our notice. And I got back to town, and my friend who was on staff, he goes, hey, guess what? Hey, this weekend we have a guest speaker. He's a prophetic guy from Africa. It's going to be really cool. I go, oh, cool. I hang up, and I'm going, oh, no. I don't like those guys. Because prophetic guys scare me to death. Like, it's terrifying to me. And so, we met at Lakeview High School, our church did. And it's a big auditorium, and there's a balcony on the top. And, about halfway back in the auditorium, there's the overhang, just like here. But there's chairs underneath the overhang. And so what happens is when you get to the chairs that are underneath the balcony, there's shadows. And so on this particular Sunday, instead of sitting in the front row with the other pastors on staff, I said, hey, man, let's just sit back here. I'm not even telling her why. I'm just like, let's just sit back here. I said, just mix the things up a little bit, whatever. And so I'm thinking, it just would be easier if I'm not anywhere near that guy that I've never met. I don't know anything about him. I just know I don't want him to talk to me. And so he preaches this message, and it was a great message. And then he finishes. And I've been in services where there's been somebody prophetic before, and I've kind of seen how that works. But this guy just finishes, then he kind of walks down. All right, I'd like to share some words now with people. There's no music playing. There's nothing happening. He's just kind of walking around. And so keep in mind, I'm back there. And the way the seats are, I am strategic. I'm a strategic thinker. And so I sit down. We're all sitting, but the head that was in front of me, I kind of sit like this. So I am directly behind this head. So in my mind, I am virtually invisible. I cannot be seen. Well, I hear this guy, and he's like, okay, yeah, you over there. I don't see what he's doing. I can hear him because I'm not looking at him. I'm not making him make no eye contact. So he goes, you over there. And I'm kind of like waiting to see who's going to stand up, right? And so I don't hear anything. And so then what feels to me like he's moving, and he's like, you over there. And again, I'm still thinking, there's no chance. There's like 500 people in here. There is no chance. So, you over there. Again, nothing happens. I'm like, who is the idiot that's not raising their hand? So then all of a sudden, he goes, you right here, the one that's not looking at me. I think I can't be the only one not looking at him. So I kind of dart my eyes up, and he's standing like right outside my row. He goes, you, come here. I'm going, oh, dear Jesus. Oh, God, please don't let him keep the microphone up. Please, God, no. And so I come up front, and he puts the microphone down, and he says, you're considering leaving your time here is not yet done. You need to plant your flag. I was so mad at God because I wanted to go home. Right? I was ready in my heart to go home. We stayed. We stayed 2 more years and served God the best that we could. And we saw, honestly, it was the second 2 years that our youth group exploded. It was the second 2 years that we saw kids coming off the street and come to know Christ, and families changed and transformed. And we saw all these amazing things happen those second 2 years. I will say, year 4, when I felt God release us, I remember we were flying home from vacation back over here. We're coming home, and as we were coming, I said, Amy, I said, did you feel that? She goes, what? I go, I think God just said we can go home. We barely landed. I'm calling the pastor, hey, I'm so sorry, but we're out. And so we came back here. But so get out of the boat. In Matthew 14, in verse 22. Oh, wait, it changed on me. Now it's New Living Translation. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. I've read that passage multiple times, and I've imagined myself, I don't know if you guys do this, but when I see and read stories, I imagine, what would I do in that scenario? And I think about my life, and most of the time, I would be one of the guys in the boat who just sat there and watched Peter act like an idiot and step out of the boat onto the water, knowing that he can't walk on water. But think about this. Think about this story. The disciples and Peter are in the boat, and Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, let me walk on water." But think about whatever, the next week, the next dinner that they're having, they're around the fire. How does this story not come up amongst the disciples? Hey, guess what? I walked on water. Right? As I just imagine the disciples shooting the breeze, Peter saying, "I walked on water." Now, of course, they're going to say, "Yeah, you sunk. You took a couple steps and then you sunk. But I walked on water." In that story, I don't know about you, but I want to be the guy who walked on water. To experience something that I've never experienced before. To experience something that's not physically possible. To know that for those few moments, he's walking with the power and the strength of Jesus Christ, empowering him to walk on top of the waves, right? So often, as believers, we're the ones in the boat watching somebody else, hearing their story, hearing their testimony, hearing the great works that God has done through them, simply because we refuse to take that first step of faith. And can I just tell you, that first step of faith, it's the hardest step in the world. When we said yes to going to Chicago, can I tell you, that was the hardest thing that I'd ever done at that point in my life. Nothing about it made sense. When I told Pastor Joe, who was the pastor at the time of Cedar Park, he's like, wait. He goes, what are they offering you? And I told him, he goes, and you're doing it? He goes, you don't have another job. He goes, I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you, I was getting a small stipend at Kenmore for being youth pastor. He goes, I'm going to double it. He goes, I'm going to double that. He goes, then you just stay. And I was like, Pastor Joe, I love that, but I can't stay. He goes, okay, that's great. He goes, because if you would have said yes, I would have been really disappointed. But taking that first step of faith is the hardest step to take. Because I don't know about you, but the way my brain works is I like to know the details. I like to kind of plan things in advance. My wife people will say, well, what's plan B if that doesn't work? And my wife will always joke and say, ask them about plan C and plan D. Because if something doesn't work, I'm always thinking of, well, what will I do if that doesn't work? And if that doesn't work? And if that's out of control, what will I do then? I like to know the details. So saying yes to going to a place that I wasn't familiar with, to people that I wasn't familiar with, was not easy. But what I saw was God's hand and God's blessing in it. You see, so often when people read this story, just as important as Peter taking that step of faith, walking on the water, the next thing is, he says, but when he saw the strong wind and waves, he was terrified and began to sink. What is the wind and the waves for us today? The wind and the waves is all the details that aren't going to work out. All the things that you take that first step and you're like, wait, how will I pay the bills? Wait, what about my kids? What about finding a school? What about finding a job? What about making friends? Can I tell you, you move across the country, you don't have the same friends, especially when you grow up in one spot and you have these lifetime friends, and then you move across and you're like, I don't know anybody. The wind and the waves. The problem today is that we see the wind and the waves. Can I get a little bit personal here? You see the pride flag at the school, the wind and the waves. You see Pride Month, the wind and the waves. We see what's happening in our culture today, the wind and the waves. But God is bigger. God is greater. God is more faithful. God is faithful to completion. God does not stop midway. It doesn't always happen in our timing or the way that we think or want, which sometimes is hard. Because I don't know about you, but I will pray to God and I give him exactly how it should work. And just say, God, if it happened this way and this happened to this person, I said, I think that would be best. And I'm very specific with him on how he should do things. And often it doesn't happen that way. But often when I look back in hindsight, I'm like, wow, God. Here's one. Often when we're sick, my mom had a stroke about 15 years ago. And to this day, right, she has limited mobility, limited speech, limited movement, all these things. And I believe that God is a healer, right? I believe that with everything that is in me. I've prayed with people. I've seen them healed before my eyes, but not my mom. Hey, not my mom. I don't know why. I know she will be healed, right? Whether it's this side of heaven or the other, she'll walk again. She'll talk again. I don't mind that she doesn't talk so much now, but she still can talk, just not as quickly, which gives me the advantage. I get in way less trouble now these days. But God is faithful. So church, today, I think about when God calls us, when God plants dreams in your lives, when God asks you to do things. What's bigger, the call that God has or the wind and the waves? You see, can I just be honest? For me, most of the time, it's the wind and the waves. Most of the time, if I'm just telling the truth, I'm like, God, that feels uncomfortable. I think I would be embarrassed. I don't think that's going to work out the way you think it is. Because I know better, And the wind and the waves are strong. And they often will deter me from doing what I think God's called me to do. Even though I've seen God's faithfulness, even though I've seen God move in my life, in my family's life, in the life of Wonder Church. I've heard testimonies from CJ and the team of things that have happened to people in the congregation here in your gathering. You see how God is faithful. I believe that across the room, that God has planted dreams, that God has planted callings upon each one of you. Does that mean that each one of you will be in ministry? Yes. You're like, wait, what? No, yes, it does. Sometimes I think we, especially in the American church, we think that the pastors are in ministry. But that's not true. We're all in ministry, right? Remember, for most of my adult life, working life, I have worked in the secular world. I've had a regular job, just like probably most of you. I worked with secular people. When I was in Chicago, I worked at Sedgwick CMS. I got this job. There was a gal at my church in Chicago who worked there before me. My first day at the job, they said, hey, you know him. Why don't you walk him around the floor and introduce him? And that was horrible. Keisha. So in Chicago, pastors are treated a little bit differently there. It's very different, especially from culture here. Always, I'm called Pastor Steve. Always. It's just different. And so I'm called that sometimes here too, but it's just different. And so Keisha, on the first day, she's taking me around this very large office floor, and hi, CJ, this is Pastor Steve. He's my pastor. Everybody on the floor. I'm introduced day one as Pastor Steve, to my horror. I remember I told you I've worked secular jobs. I have never led with, I'm a Christian. Never. I have always just I want to wait for the door to open, for the opportunity to kind of ease things in, to kind of, gently walk down into that road or let people notice there's something different about me. But when you're announced as you're a Christian, it's like driving down the road with a Jesus loves you bumper sticker, right? Everyone's watching your behavior. Everyone knows who you're proclaiming to be. So day one, Pastor Steve. It wasn't but a few weeks later, I'm in my office and it's the first one started. Hey, you're a pastor? Like, yeah. Me and my wife are having these marriage problems. Do you think you could meet with us? I'm like, oh, well, sure. So we set up dinner. We started doing marriage counseling with that couple. Hey, I'm not really so sure what I think about faith. Can you talk to me about this Jesus guy? Can I tell you, my time in Chicago, the church was amazing, but that time at that insurance company was like, oh my goodness, God. Did you call me to the church or to this job? Because the people that are just knocking on my door, I'm not having to do anything. God's just bringing them up before, asking questions about faith. So when I say that we're all in ministry, you're in ministry at your job. Right? You're in ministry at your job. Now, when I worked at PEMCO, I told you I was quiet. But the guy next to me, without me ever telling him, knew that I was a believer. He had a faith background, but he had kind of walked away. One day, he was at a dentist appointment. He comes back to the office, and everyone is off the floor for a meeting. But I was still, I don't remember why I was still there, but I was still at my cube. And I hear somebody walking in the office. And then I hear like quick walking. He's like, hey, hello? And then I hear like running. And he's like, Steve? And I'm like, yeah? He's like, oh, thank God. I said, what are you talking about? He goes, I thought the rapture happened. He said, I thought the rapture happened, and so I thought if Steve's here, I'm going to be okay. And See, but God opened the door to that conversation, right? Because Aaron and I hadn't talked about faith yet. He just observed from my behavior that he knew I was a believer. Because I didn't curse and I didn't complain about my boss, though I wanted to. All the things I thought would be good identifiers. So what is my point today? My point is this. Do you want to help me out here, Madison, a little bit? There's going to be opportunity in your life. Maybe it's going to be today, where you see something and you hear God calling, God tugging, and you're contemplating, what do I do? I think the answer is you get out of the boat. And you're going to see the wind and the waves and struggle with the details like, well, God, I'm not really prepared to do that. God, I don't know that I'm equipped to do that. I don't know that I'm resolved to do that. Get out of the boat anyway. Too often, we don't see the miracles of God because we don't put our faith and trust in God. We don't take that step of faith. How do you see God's miraculous hand if you never give him the opportunity? Right? Often, we're comfortable sitting in the boat watching other people. I want to be the one that has the story. I want to be the one that has a story that says, I met a friend and I didn't think I knew what to say, but they said something, so I just started talking, and suddenly we're talking about faith, and doors are opened up. They're coming to church with me. Or I got to lead them in a prayer. Right now, I serve as executive pastor at Cedar Park, and I volunteer at the city of Kirkland as a chaplain. It's a very rewarding experience. I have to find the right word. It's not fun because if they call the chaplain, it means somebody died, right? So I get to go and see lots of dead bodies. A lot of them are just people age out, and it's time, and other ones more recently have been suicide or drug overdose or things like that. But what I see happening is that in my world, I'm so connected to church and work at church and everything's at church that I was losing that opportunity to connect with people outside of church. And so I thought, well, here's a way. So I get to go to people's homes, or the other day I was out in the woods with the family with the suicide, and mom and dad and brother and sister and aunt are all out there with the police, and they believe there was a God, but that's about as far as their faith took them. But upon my arrival, they were quick to want to talk about faith, to want to talk about Jesus, to want to pray together. And what I keep seeing is opportunities to get out of the boat. I keep seeing opportunities where, you know this, church, we live in a broken world. I go to people's homes and for these chaplain calls and see how people live, and you see the brokenness all around you. And I see that I have the opportunity to bring the light of Jesus. Can I tell you, it's amazing. It's so cool. Yes, somebody just died, and that's horrible and it's sad, but to have the opportunity to talk about Jesus right after, to bring comfort to people, and to see Jesus start to do a work as you're having conversations. We all have those opportunities with friends and family. Will you stand with me today? Will you bow your heads with me for a moment? I think today that God's going to awaken that call that God has on some of you in here today. Maybe you've had that kind of nudge in your heart. You're like, we're supposed to do something, but you're fighting it, you're resisting it. I think that today God's saying, get out of the boat. I'll work out the details. If you just trust me, and know that I am good. For some, it's going to be as simple as talking to a friend, taking those opportunities before you, sharing your faith, sharing conversation, sharing stories that help lead people towards Jesus. So I'm going to say a prayer and just want to agree that God's going to give you that courage to step out of the boat. Lord, thank you that you are faithful. Thank you that you are good. Lord, thank you that you do care about each and every detail. Forgive us, Lord, for sometimes being too comfortable, for being too set in our ways, for often choosing easy. Lord, I would ask that today that you would outpour your Spirit upon your people. Lord, that each one of us would feel your encouragement, that we would feel your challenge to step out, and that we would feel the confidence that as we take that step of faith, that you have us in the palm of your hand. That you have us in the palm of your hand. And that even when the wind and the waves come, and should we start to sink, that we know whom to turn to. And that's Jesus, who quickly reached out his hand and pulled Peter back up. So Lord, we trust you today. We love you today. And Lord, have your way in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen and amen.
Thank you for joining us this morning. My prayer for you is that the Holy Spirit would continue to do the work that he has started inside of you. We really do believe that discipleship happens in the context of relationship. You do not have to be alone. So I would love to invite you to join us on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. at Redmond Middle School. Finally, if this message blessed you, it would help us a lot if you liked, subscribed, and shared it with a friend. Doing so will help spread the good news of Jesus Christ and help us accomplish our mission of empowering people to be everything Jesus made them to be.